It survived 35 suspects. It outlived the killer himself. And for 65 years, the evidence that would finally expose a murderer sat quietly in a forgotten evidence locker. January 2nd, 1956, Great Falls, Montana. A young couple parked at Lover's Lane, their car found running, radio playing, but the seats were empty. Hours later, the horrifying truth emerged: an execution on the frozen ground. Tonight, we're reconstructing one of the longest unsolved murders in American history. We're tracking the killer who hid in plain sight and uncovering the one piece of evidence that broke the silence after 6 decades. This is the story of Patty Kalitsky and Lloyd Bogle. Great Falls, Montana, 1956. Winter didn't just visit this place, it ruled it. The cold swept across the northern plains with a brutal, relentless force. No mountains to block it, no forests to break its path. Just miles of open country where the wind could gather speed and strike with brutal intensity. Residents were used to harsh winters, but that night felt different. The temperature had plunged well below freezing. Snow patches covered the ground, and the Missouri River looked frozen and lifeless beneath a gray, heavy sky. Most people stayed indoors. But at 16, Patty Kalitsky wasn't a girl who stayed in the background. Friends described her as warm, outgoing, and popular. She wasn't someone who faded into the shadows. People noticed her, not because she demanded attention, but because she naturally attracted it. She laughed easily, made friends quickly, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin. She was the kind of teenager who seemed destined for a bright, expansive future. A future she would never get the chance to see. Just a few months earlier, 18-year-old Lloyd Dwayne Bogle had arrived in Montana from Texas. He was stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base as a young airman. Like many military recruits, he was adjusting to life far away from everything he knew. The endless Montana landscape was a shock to a boy from the South. The weather was unforgiving, the winters were biting, and everything felt unfamiliar. And then he met Patty. Their connection was immediate. In a town defined by gray winters, they were an explosion of color. They shared the same taste in music, the same enthusiasm for dancing, and the same excitement about the future. In many ways, they were exactly what mid-century America imagined young love looked like: innocent, hopeful, and full of possibility. On the evening of January 2nd, the couple spent time together like they had many times before. Nothing about the night seemed unusual. Nothing hinted at the horror waiting in the dark. After spending part of the evening at Pete's Drive-In, they climbed into Lloyd's car and drove toward the Sun River. They called it Lover's Lane, a rite of passage for every teenager in town, a place for privacy, dreams, and futures. For years, it had been considered a safe haven. That illusion was about to shatter. As they drove toward that secluded area, they couldn't have known someone was crossing their path. Someone who had already decided what was going to happen. Someone whose identity would remain hidden for more than 60 years. By the next morning, silence. The families weren't panicked. Not yet. Teenagers stay out late. They make impulsive decisions. But by midday, the silence felt heavy. Calls were made, friends were contacted, questions were asked. Nobody had seen them. Nobody knew where they were. By midday, worry turned into a cold, sinking fear. Then, 3 boys exploring the riverbank found the car. It wasn't just parked. It looked abandoned. The engine was still running. The headlights remained on. The radio continued playing. Yet there was no movement inside. As they approached, the horrifying reality emerged. A body lay beside the driver's side door. The victim was Lloyd Dwayne Bogle. He was face down on the frozen ground. His hands had been secured behind his back using his own belt. A single gunshot wound to the back of his head left no doubt. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution. But where was Patty? The discovery of Lloyd's body triggered immediate panic. Search teams mobilized across Cascade County. Volunteers joined law enforcement. Every road was checked, every field searched, every riverbank examined. For 2 days, searchers combed the Montana countryside, praying they were just 1 hour behind. Then, on January 4th, a county road worker made a devastating discovery. Near Vineyard Road, roughly 5 miles from the car, he noticed something unusual near a steep embankment. What he found ended any remaining hope. Patricia Kalitsky lay at the bottom. She had been shot in the head. The autopsy revealed a final, brutal layer of cruelty. Patty had been sexually assaulted. The case had transformed from a double homicide into a predatory nightmare. Great Falls had never experienced anything quite like it. People locked their doors. Parents warned their children. Rumors spread like wildfire through town. Every stranger became suspicious. Every unusual sighting generated new, wild theories. Residents demanded answers. Who could do something like this? Why target 2 young people? And where was the killer now? The pressure on law enforcement became enormous. They had 2 murdered teenagers, a terrified community, and almost no physical clues to work with. Detectives began reconstructing the final hours of the victims' lives. The evidence suggested a chilling, systematic sequence of events. At some point during the night, the killer confronted the couple. Lloyd was restrained, executed. Patty was abducted. What happened during the hours between Lloyd's death and Patty's murder remains the dark, unanswered question at the center of this story. Only one person ever knew the full story, and he never told a soul. The silence surrounding those missing hours would haunt investigators for 6 decades. The case quickly became the biggest investigation Great Falls had ever seen. Leads poured in from every direction. Tips arrived daily. People reported suspicious neighbors, former boyfriends, traveling drifters, military personnel. Anyone remotely connected to the victims found themselves under intense scrutiny. Detectives chased every lead, but some seemed promising only to collapse under closer examination. What nobody realized at the time was that the real killer had already slipped through their fingers. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding in a different state. He was living his life exactly as before, only a short distance away, watching, waiting, and carrying a secret that would remain buried for 65 years. We have the victims. We have the crime. But we have a mystery that spanned 2 generations of forensic science. How does a man hide in plain sight for 6 decades? And what was the one piece of forgotten evidence that finally blew the case wide open? The investigation was only beginning. Over the next 6 decades, detectives would examine 35 suspects, investigate a future notorious gangster, and pursue countless dead ends before a revolutionary DNA breakthrough finally exposed the man who had remained invisible all along. The failure was not in the effort. The detectives of the 1950s did everything they could with the tools they had. They took fingerprints, they interviewed witnesses, they documented the scene. But forensic science was in its infancy. There was no DNA, no advanced ballistics, no modern digital trail. They were fighting a ghost with a magnifying glass. As the years turned into decades, the case file grew thick, yellowed with age, a monument to a tragedy that refused to fade. It was passed from one detective to the next. Every time a new technological breakthrough occurred, the file was pulled from the cabinet, dusted off, and looked at with fresh eyes. Was there something here? Something we missed. A fingerprint that hadn't been processed properly. A piece of clothing that still held a trace of the past. The killer knew this. He knew that time was on his side. As long as he stayed quiet, as long as he didn't draw attention to himself, he was safe. And that is exactly what he did. He blended into the fabric of the community. He worked, he lived, he aged. He saw the world change around him, while he remained a fixed point of darkness in an otherwise changing landscape. But even a ghost leaves a trace. The thing about evidence is that it doesn't rot. It doesn't forget. It doesn't get old and tired. It just waits. And while the world moved from the era of black and white film to the digital age, while the men who investigated the crime retired and eventually passed away, that piece of evidence, that tiny microscopic fragment of the truth, remained in that evidence locker, holding on to the identity of the person who had ended Patty and Lloyd's lives. In Part 2, we dive into those decades of failure. We look at the rise of a new suspect, the cold trails that led detectives down the wrong path, and the specific moment when science finally caught up to the past. The technology was there, the evidence was there, but it required a new generation of investigators to connect the dots in a way no one had thought possible. The truth is never truly buried. It just waits for someone to look in the right place. Subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion. I'll see you in the next one.